Game in your head, and maybe it's just me because I'm kind of strange, where you imagined what it might be like if you had lived in a different place or a different time.
Still good.
Yeah. I mean, there's some really cool times to live in, and then there's others that maybe not so cool that you really would just want to pass over. For example, I'm really glad that I'm not a Puritan. You know, that was just, they had it rough, if you want to think about it. I mean, it was a rough time. And first of all, the period of time wasn't so great. But just being a Puritan was pretty rough. I mean, they had lots of rules. And there were some pretty serious consequences if you messed up on the rules. And so they had rules about all kinds of things. And not just the standard stuff, like lying and cheating and stealing, fornication, like, a lot of Christians would have. But they had rules about all kinds of other things, like gambling and great games, dress and behavior. And so it was one of those things. I mean, church attendance, of course, was mandatory. And there were also fines, by the way, for sleeping in church. So I just want to make you aware of that.
Make them louder.
Yes. And PDA, of course, was definitely out of the question, especially on Sundays. And so there was a certain sea captain who made this mistake of kissing his wife after he returned on a Sunday after being gone for 3 years. And he kissed his wife on that Sunday, and they put him in the stocks for several hours. I'm like, come on, cut the guy a break. It's been like 3 years. So just being a Puritan, it wasn't a great life. And they thought it was, I guess. But although I didn't grow up a Puritan, I mean, I did grow up in a fairly legalistic form of religion. I mean, there were lots of rules. There were a lot of do's and don'ts. Not like the generation before me. I mean, they were even worse off. They had all kinds of things, and, dice was out, cards were out, going to the movies was out, all that kind of stuff. I didn't grow up like that. But still, there were lots of things that people would frown upon. And, living under a faith like that, you just never were sure. You couldn't be real confident about your salvation. You never were quite, there was always this kind of sense of doubt. Have I done enough? Am I good enough? And will I make it in? And, wow, that's not a good place to be. So I won't, it's not hard for me to remember, I should say. I won't forget when I first kind of understood and learned about grace. The concept was not only liberating, it was like opening up a whole new world for me in many ways. In fact, I'm almost sorry for those who didn't grow up under legalism. Because I don't know if you can truly appreciate grace until you really know what its absence feels like. Until you've been under the thumb and you feel the burden of guilt and sin. I don't know if grace really can be as powerful for you. Of course, grace is far more popular these days. There's lots of Christian traditions that are talking about it. It's a familiar kind of idea. But 2 weeks ago, you might remember, we talked about this kind of misunderstanding of grace that I think is fairly common, where it's become kind of the get-out-of-jail-free card. And when you've done something wrong, you just kind of, oh, that's grace. And so you sometimes will use it to alleviate guilt, but sometimes people also use grace to kind of dismiss the seriousness of sin, even perhaps to rationalize behaviors that you're involved in that are kind of not things you're supposed to be doing. And you say, well, it's okay because we live under grace and not under law. And so it allows people to go on living in the way that they have always lived before, and without guilt or concern, however. So, it's a good thing in their minds. But as we've seen, this isn't a new view at all, that the Corinthians had a misunderstanding of God's grace that was very similar to this. It's something that shows up in the earliest of Christian communities. And so a couple of weeks ago we talked about the phenomenon where you had some of these Corinthian Christians who were going to prostitutes, and they were using a slogan to kind of rationalize this. All things are lawful. And if you look at 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23, you'll see that very same slogan shows up again. All things are lawful. Now, some might even translate it, I have the right to do anything. So it depends on which version you have. But it was the sentiment that they used to rationalize and justify going to prostitutes, but it was also something that they used to rationalize going and attending meals at pagan temples. And it's this latter issue that we're going to talk about this morning. It's the issue that kind of consumes chapters 8 through 10. Paul's teaching concerning food sacrificed to idols. Now, you might immediately ask in your own mind, probably not out loud unless you're Sam, what possible relevance could this have for us? I mean, this seems really kind of antiquated and irrelevant, does it not? I mean, after all, when was the last time that any of you had this powerful temptation to go to a pagan temple, let alone to perhaps eat from the sacrifices that have been offered there? Can't we just kind of like bypass this section and say, that's very historically interesting, but, thanks, no thanks. On the contrary, however, what I contend is that embedded in this, in his instructions to these early Christians, is something that is fundamental to the Christian faith. There's a principle here that's at the very heart of the gospel. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll get to that later. All right, so let's look at what we got here. So we have, as we've seen, we have Corinthian Christians who are fairly recently converted from a very pagan background. So they're not Jews. They weren't raised in the church. And so for these particular folks, there were a lot of issues that they were encountering for the first time, and the, quote, Christian thing to do was not always so obvious to them. It's like they weren't raised with, that's what Christ would do. And so there's a rather large piece that they have to kind of figure out and resolve, centers around pagan temples. And so in chapters 8 through 10, Paul is addressing issues that are related to food that has been sacrificed to idols. And you might think that this is a no-brainer, of course, that Christians should never, ever, in any way, be involved in pagan temples. But pagan temples in Corinth were kind of like Christian churches in Nashville. I mean, there's like one at every corner. They were all over the place. And the gods, of course, were worshipped by sacrificing to them. And so there's lots of meat floating around in the city that is related to these pagan temples. So Paul has to kind of address three primary scenarios. We're going to talk about each of these three. The first one is eating food actually in an idol's temple. We'll deal with that one first. But then there's two others that are kind of connected to this. One is, if you bought food in the marketplace, there's a potential for idol meat to be in the marketplace. And then the third issue is, what if you're invited over to a non-Christian's home for dinner? And what do you do in that situation? So those are the three issues we're going to talk about. Let's deal with the first one, this idea of eating in an idol's temple. Now that one might be like, okay, it's very simple. You just don't go to an idol's temple. Why would you go to the idol's temple? But it's a bit more complicated than that, you see. First of all, you have to recognize that the Greeks and the Romans were both very kind of social people, and one of their favorite social activities was what we call the formal banquet. The rich would often host these banquets in their homes. It would be for their friends and their cronies, also sometimes for their less well-off clients. There would be a kind of actually, not I said a sit-down meal, but it would be a leaning over on your couch kind of meal. And you'd eat this banquet, and then there would be some kind of entertainment afterward, either a philosophical discussion, a musical performance, a poetry reading, something that would enliven the evening. But banquets were held for all kinds of different occasions. They were held for birthday parties, they were held for coming-of-age parties, there were guild meetings if you were part of a trade group. There were even burial societies that would meet together for banquets. This was basically made up of poor people who kind of chipped in and paid for the expenses to bury each other. And they wanted to make sure that there would be actually somebody at their funeral. And so they would get together before a funeral just to kind of have a little club meeting and say, whoever dies next, we'll take care of you, that kind of thing. Maybe a little bit morbid, but they did that. So they had all kinds of things. And for most people, of course, they didn't have a house that was big enough to have a banquet, to host a banquet. And so they would have to rent some kind of facility. And one of the most common places to rent a dining hall in the ancient world was in a temple. Much like in a Christian church, where a lot of Christian churches, they'll have a fellowship hall that they, of course, use for themselves, but they can also rent that out to others. You can rent it for a wedding, and you have a wedding in the church, and you have a wedding reception in the fellowship hall, and so you don't have to be a part of that church at all. You just rent their facility. So that's the kind of idea that you have. So in the ancient world, you'd have these people who would rent out banquet halls or dining rooms in the pagan temples. And we know this because we've had a whole host of invitations discovered, which were on the PowerPoint, a couple of them, but so get that. But they showed you, on Tuesday you were invited to the table of the Lord Serapis and the Serapion for the coming of age party of whoever the person was, that was inviting you. And so you imagine yourself as a Christian in Corinth who receives an invitation from a non-Christian relative, from a friend, perhaps even a business associate or your boss, to a birthday party, to a coming of age party, whatever it might be, and you're in quite the dilemma now, because it would be somewhat rude not to go. And so there's a theology here that the Corinthians had that kind of came to their rescue. We see this clearly in chapter 8. So if you have a Bible, turn to the first section of chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. Now, concerning food offered to idols, we know that, quote, all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Therefore, as to the eating of food sacrificed to idols, we know that, quote, an idol has no real existence, and that, quote, there is no God but one. For although there are many so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things are, and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. Now, notice the quotation marks, if you have a good Bible. If you don't, just throw that one out and get another one. The quotation marks around some of those phrases. That here, once again, are statements that reflect the Corinthian perspective. At least some of them. This is their rationalization that they're using to participate in these kinds of meals. And we can tell from verse 10 later on that at least some of them are doing this kind of thing. And so they're thinking of something like this. We've learned as Christians that there's only one God. And if so, what that means is that the gods of the pagans, they aren't really real at all. And so we can't worship something that doesn't exist, right? So to eat this food would be harmless. Indeed, it might even show how spiritual we are, that we can eat this food recognizing that it's nothing but, ordinary food. And so their knowledge that these gods do not exist enables them to go to these pagan temples and to eat this meat with a clean conscience. After all, they're not participating in a pagan worship service in honor of the god. I mean, it is at an idol's temple, and it most likely was that the food that was served to them had been previously sacrificed in honor of the god. And most likely there was a libation poured out in front of the god, in honor of the god. But it wasn't normal worship of the deity that they were being involved in this particular meal. It was simply a birthday party. And the gods aren't real after all. That's all they're thinking. So remember that the separation between the sacred and the secular isn't as clear in ancient times as we've tried to make it today. And so this is what causes the problem. The logic seems sound, but what Paul wants them to realize is that there's a greater guiding principle than simply what they know, that knowledge isn't the only thing that's at stake here. Love is more important than knowledge. And knowledge might say it's okay, but love would say, we got to do something else. But then you're thinking, well, how in the world is love involved in this picture at all? So let's read on, verse 7 and following. However, not all possess this knowledge, but some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, no better if we do. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols? And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Now, the problem is that not all of the Corinthian Christians have the same understanding, right? Some of them have not quite realized that the gods aren't real, that they don't exist. After all, it was just a short time ago that they were worshiping these gods as real, as true. And so Paul's concern here is that the Christians with knowledge, those who feel confident in eating in the idol's temple without violating their conscience, will have this negative impact on the other Christians who have a weaker conscience. And the sense of a weaker conscience means that they're uncertain, that they're not sure, that they're kind of on the fence as to what is right or wrong. And so Paul says, suppose they see you eating in the idol's temple. You, a fellow Christian, now they're confused because they thought, I thought we didn't do that kind of thing anymore. And they themselves then might decide to accept an invitation to a birthday party or whatever at the temple. But when they participate, it's not with the same knowledge that you have. When they participate, in their minds, the gods are still quite real. And so they have now slipped back into paganism, in a sense. They're worshiping idols, in a sense, because they're not so sure about this whole knowledge that you have. So Paul says they've been destroyed because of the knowledge of their fellow Christians. Now let's reflect on that. Is it truly their fault, meaning the strong Christians' fault? After all, what the strong did was perfectly with a clean conscience. I mean, they didn't have any doubts. They can't help it if somebody else is uncertain or unsure. But Paul says it is their responsibility. For these weaker Christians are brothers and sisters for whom Christ has died. They are part of the family. And love dictates that one acts with the best interests of others in mind. And so Paul comes out with this kind of startling conclusion in verse 13. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Now, this is a horrifying thought for a carnivore such as myself. I mean, really, think about it. No more hamburgers, no more steak. That would be horrible. I mean, why would you even suggest such a thing, Paul? Just rip that part out of the Bible. That's just not good. But Paul's point is that he's willing to sacrifice his own rights for the sake of others. Now, we have to be careful here. You see, this text has often been used and abused as the infamous weaker brother argument. I don't know if you've heard that one before, right? But it's usually trotted out by some unhappy church member who doesn't like what's happening. And so then they'll claim, I'm the weaker brother here because you're offending me, and you need to stop doing what you're doing because Paul says not to offend the weaker brother. That's the way they use that one. And I'm thinking, no, you're not. Okay, you've missed the whole point of the text. Because the text has nothing to do with offending others. That's not what it's about. Right? It has everything to do with how your actions impact others in ways that are detrimental and harmful. For in this context, it leads others to, in some sense, abandon their faith. And so that's the problem. It's not that they're getting offended at all. So, let's look quickly at the other two issues that Paul has to address here in, skip down to verse 23. In chapter 10, verse 23. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Now, notice again these quotation marks around all things are lawful. And the line is repeated. Here are those Corinthian slogans that we saw back in chapter 6. But notice Paul's response, which also happens to be the same as chapter 6. Not all things are beneficial. Not all things are helpful. It is here, in particular, that we see the Corinthian misunderstanding of grace. For them, it has been interpreted as, well, all things are lawful. I can do whatever I need to, whatever I want to. And they most likely probably twisted this, the teaching of Paul himself, and misunderstood it in ways that kind of serve their own purposes. In their minds, God's grace covers all. There's nothing to worry about here. Yet for Paul, the issue is not about rights. not about privileges. The guiding principle, what directs our actions, is what is beneficial to others, what is helpful, particularly to those around me, those that I touch and those that I influence. And we see this when he gives very clear advice about these other two issues. Look at verse 25. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any questions on the ground of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. You see, the meat market, as I said before, was a challenge for these Corinthian Christians because the excess meat from the sacrifices was sold in the meat market. And it wasn't as if there was a sign on it that said, offered to Apollo this morning. It just looked like the slide of beef next to it. And you couldn't tell. And so it's like, do I have to ask, well, do you know where this beef came from? Was this from the temple of Apollo? Or where, You didn't have to ask, Paul says. So Paul's answer to this question is just eat the meat without asking questions. There's no taint on the meat itself. And in that context, outside in the meat market, there's no religious association with it whatsoever. So eat it. Now the third piece is really interesting. So the third issue is, well, what if I go over to an unbeliever's house? Let's look at verse 27 and following. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without asking or raising any questions on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then don't eat it, for the sake of the one who informs you and for the sake of conscience. I don't mean your conscience, but his. So the third scenario is related to this kind of eating at a non-Christian's house. They call you over. And the principle is basically the same as eating in the food offered in the meat market. Just go ahead and eat it. You don't have to ask questions. You don't have to interrogate your host and say, well, where did you get this meat? Has this been offered or not? Because I can't eat it. There's no taint on the meat. It's just regular meat. But here's where it gets interesting. If the non-Christian host says to you, well, this meat has been offered to an idol, then don't eat it, he says. Why? Because of their conscience. Because the only reason that they would have brought that up is because they might think that you as a Christian would have a problem with eating food offered to idols. And so because they think it's wrong, don't do it. Because you don't want them to think that there's anything in your life that is honoring or worshiping of pagan idols. You want to make it very clear that your loyalty is to Christ. And so because their conscience is weak, you change your behavior and adhere to a more rigorous kind of activity, if you want to think of it that way. So, how is any of this relevant for us as we think about that? What specific issue? I mean, this is not an issue that we face. Although, interestingly enough, I am reminded of an occasion several years ago, about 10 minutes down the street, when I took a class to the Hindu temple and we were faced with, are we going to eat the idol food or not? I'll tell you that story later. But anyway, notice the end of the passage, verses 31 and following. So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Now, although the kind of the versification places that last line as the beginning of chapter 11, I think that's kind of inappropriate. I think it actually finishes this 8 through 10 discussion, and it really closes out the thought of that. You see, the fundamental way in which we imitate Christ is by placing the needs of others in front of our own, which brings us back to this misunderstanding of grace I talked about at the beginning. This thought that all things are lawful is not just an idea of the ancient Corinthian Christians. It's an idea that's still well and alive in our churches today, especially among American Christians who are very consumerist in this culture and in the church as well. And we're always consumed with how things affect me and how things benefit me and how I can get ahead and all that good stuff. And so we've been sold this kind of cheap form of grace. It's a freedom from guilt without restrictions on our behavior. The law-free gospel has been interpreted as do what you want, for grace will cover it and take care of it. And the pendulum has swung from legalism to libertinism. And this is the dilemma, I think, that's the problem. Because grace, of course, is not a license to sin. It's not an excuse to do what you want. It's not about God getting lax or God lowering the bar. So how do we avoid these two extremes? The extreme I was raised with of legalism. You know, if I put strong rules in place, then I've fallen back into legalism. But if I don't have any rules, then isn't that libertinism? Then isn't anything goes? How do you strike that balance between those two, I think, false kinds of ideas? And that's where this text, I think, gives us a way out. It gives us a way to solve that dilemma. Because you see, what this text tells us is that faith and salvation isn't all about me. You know, often Americans especially, we think in individualistic terms. But what Paul and especially Jesus, both of them are trying to say is that this whole thing about the kingdom, it's a team sport. We're in it together as a family, as a body. We're not in it alone. And everything we do isn't about me. And it's not about my own glory and my own satisfaction and my own needs. It's about the good of the whole. It's about the good of the family. It's about the good of everyone else, about others. That God is not just redeeming us. He's attempting to redeem the world. And so the guiding principle for Christians is not knowledge. Our actions should be determined not by what I can do, but what I should do. It's about not pressing my own rights, but looking to see how will this impact the lives of those around me. How will it benefit others? This is the principle that led Jesus throughout his ministry to sacrifice and eventually go to the cross. You see, we've received the grace of God, not merely so we can bask in its glory, but so that we can be agents of grace to others. Paul wants us to think about how our actions affect and benefit those around them, or how they might harm. Will what I do bring people closer to God or move them farther away? You know, in many ways, it's a far harder path than legalism, if you think about it. You see, we could make a rule that says, don't ever go to a pagan temple. Done. Got that one taken care of. But this principle says, how do my choices, how does what I'm about to do, which I think is perfectly okay, impact the lives of those around me? Is it for their good or for their ill? I have the praise team come up as we close. You see, one of the things that's going on here as we look at this text is it's pushing back against that individualistic mindset, because for many people the response would be, well, why should my freedom and why should my liberty be constrained by somebody else, especially when they've got misunderstandings going on, when they've just got a weak conscience and a weak mind? And the answer to that question, in this text, as in so much of the New Testament, is because we're guided by love. And we want the needs and the concerns and the care of that other person to be met. Let's praise God.